Yes, thank you very much, and welcome to the third session of this conference, of this workshop today, organized by the Meijers Committee and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I welcome everyone here in the room, obviously, back, but also online. If you could see me sit here, this is sort of the sad face of the pandemic. There's a moderator, and I'm talking to our stellar lineup, waiting to present and to give their contributions to this third panel. And the idea of this third panel is very much that we look into the operationalization on the ground of what we have seen in the first panel, the legal parts and the policy part in the second panel. How does that come together on the ground? And who better to ask for a keynote presentation there than Sajjad Malik, who has over 30 years of experience within the UNHCR. He's currently the director for the Division of Resilience and Solutions at the UNHCR, but has experience across the globe. Importantly, he was previously in Damascus, in Syria, at a particularly challenging time. And it's therefore a great honor that I can virtually welcome you, and I look to the screen now, that I can virtually welcome you here to The Hague. Mr. Malik, you have the floor. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having us. I heard the earlier panel, so please allow me to repeat the figures again, because it was important to put the context right. I'll try to see if I can capture some of the key messages here. So generally, we have been saying that we have been facing the worst forced displacement crisis since the World War. For the last 10 years, it's been consecutively on the rise. The numbers have doubled over the last 10 years. I think it's important to put that in perspective, refugees as well as internally displaced and other forcibly displaced. Now, we have not only been seeing the rising numbers of forcibly displaced population over the past decade, but also seen an increasing number of displaced people stuck in protracted situations. Many more refugees are coming out, many more forcibly displaced are getting more and more stuck in protracted refugee situations. We have also seen that majority of world's refugee populations are settled in lagging, underdeveloped regions in developing countries. Regions that are deeply affected by fragility and extreme poverty. And you'll see many more examples that we have seen heard this morning from other panel members, but also we can see in other data that is coming out. Each of these regions are struggling to meet their own development needs. We have seen Dadaab refugee camps that are almost now 30 years old. We saw Kakuma in the earlier study from Christopher, is also about 33 plus years old. And there are many more displacement. Syria is now in its 10th, 11th year. Rohingya refugees are going into the 6th, 7th year. And most refugee situations are becoming now protracted. Now, accommodating the sudden arrival of masses of newcomers present a challenge for host governments, as these are underdeveloped areas, poverty, not enough services, and they have to host refugees. And we also heard the number earlier, and I'll just repeat it, that more than 85% of the world refugees are hosted in developing countries. And that's a fact. I think it's important to recognize that. So I'll try to speak to some of the recent approaches and tools that we have designed to support the socioeconomic rights of refugees. Recognize the recent displacements and trends and challenges brought about by the COVID has also done a lot of additional burdens on these host communities. Inclusion and integration in host community offer the most realistic opportunities for protection for millions if it can be provided. The problem generally is that refugee problem is often been seen as a humanitarian challenge. The refugee potential is never recognized to contribute to the development of the host communities and host societies. And they're just seen as a recipient of humanitarian assistance. There are many, many examples where the potential of refugees has not been unblocked. They stay in this protracted situation for decades, potentially blocked and not used for the development of their own human development, but also development of their host communities and societies. I would also quickly come back to what the earlier panel also discussed, is the General Assembly adapted the Global Compact on Refugees. I think it's important to recognize that. And that was done in December 2018, talking about the burden and responsibility sharing. And that's an important aspect because we let these poor, underdeveloped regions host communities, hosting refugees for protected situations, and only on humanitarian assistance. And that's not burden and responsibility sharing in the true spirit. So in line with the Global Compact on Refugees, UNHCR has strengthened its partnership with development actors to advance socioeconomic development opportunities for refugees and their hosts. And it's important to include the communities that are hosting refugees in that. By supporting humanitarian assistance transitioning towards more development activities, inclusion, international services and programs. To be honest, until the point when GCR came about, UNHCR has been trying for decades to get the development actors to engage meaningfully in forced displacement. Yet, it took a combination of events. The most important one was the Syria crisis and the large movement of refugees towards Europe, as well as conversations around the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact on Migration. This brought in a renewed focus on forced displacement as also a development challenge. In 2017, the World Bank provided a helpful analytical framework that clearly put displacement on the development agenda. And they did this piece. This is my colleague who is on the call right now, was the architect of that piece, which was titled as Towards a Development Approach Supporting Refugees, the Internally Displaced and Their Hosts. This paved the way for a number of policy initiatives and financial instruments. Arguably, the biggest game changer, we strongly believe that the World Bank's decision to include forcibly displaced in the development agenda. It established its global concessional financing facility in 2016 to respond to Syria refugee crisis. Jordan and Lebanon benefited a great deal from that, but also in the 18th replenishment of the IDA, the creation of refugee sub-window, which then became window for hosts and refugees in the 19th IDA replenishment, dispersed close to over $7 billion to respond to refugee situations from 2016 to date. So the concept here was that the more countries hosting refugees and thereby providing a global public good from socioeconomic developments, the higher the likelihood that refugees will benefit from the socioeconomic development opportunities. We lent UNHCR its full support, working together with the World Bank colleagues, with the host governments, to advance refugee inclusion and protection through assessments of the refugee protection framework, identifying key protection priorities, and full support for the design and development of IDA 18 and IDA 19 finance projects. One of the tools created to help measure progress in the refugee policy review is the Refugee Policy Review Framework, which commonly is now known RPRF, which is an IDA deputy requirement for accessing IDA 19 funding. It is not meant to compare or contrast countries. It is simply there to monitor changes in policy landscape, recognizing refugees to have greater socioeconomic opportunities and live with greater dignity, unblocking their potential and working closely with the host communities. Arguably, this new tool used the World Bank, host governments, and UNHCR can now equally be used by other like-minded development actors to better channel and direct development financing. Other multilateral development banks, regional banks, and bilateral actors have been growing in the engagement to respond to those challenges. Just to give a few examples, EU's INTPA, is now a very strategic partner on forced displacement. Just recently, they've issued formal instructions to all EU delegations on the same line. Netherlands is a very strong partner in the prospects program that we have with that. Germany has been supporting DAFI scholarship for nearly 30 years now, and their BMZ is also contributing quite strongly in this domain. OECD is working on data on making sure that we have inclusion specified there. Just one example, if I can give, we have talked about access to jobs and markets, freedom of movement. One right that I would also like to highlight is the education of refugees. Currently, only 68% of children go to primary education. This number drops to 34% when it gets to secondary education, and it drops further to 5% when it comes to tertiary education. So if you can imagine the millions that we talked about, even if you can unpack it in different countries, 68% to primary school, 34% to secondary, and only 5% go to tertiary education. And this is when we talk about unblocking potential, education becomes extremely important here. Now, COVID-19 has also had a huge impact on that. We made good progress, but this COVID-19 impact has also had on refugee hosting countries a major impact, socioeconomic, and they're struggling to meet the ends meet on this. But COVID also opened up the opportunities, and UNHCR is working hard to make the case for inclusion of refugees in health services and COVID vaccination plans. 130 countries have included refugees in COVID vaccination plans. Countries who received very little quantities of vaccines have shared those with refugees. Rwanda, Kenya, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Iran. If we look at their own per capita vaccination and still sharing with the refugees, that's where we see the whole potential of inclusion that can be responded to and supported. In conclusion, I think what we are looking at is more data, more evidence, and recognition that displaced population have a potential. They can contribute to their societies and communities they're being hosted at. But this burden and responsibility sharing has to be meaningful. It has to be in equity, and we need to look at it with the way that the whole global compact on refugees is designed to make sure that these countries can host them with a bit of equity and support around that. Now, we are looking at the 1951 Convention, and as the High Commissioner said recently, and I'll just quote, "Those of us fortunate enough to live in relative prosperity and stability cannot take these gifts for granted. The shock of COVID-19 pandemic makes it clear. And those who think the Refugee Convention is either irrelevant or a nuisance may one day find themselves grateful for the protection it affords them. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown, as almost no other crisis can, the vital importance of inclusion, collective, concrete efforts to protect the most vulnerable and to grant these rights to the fullest." I pass it back to you.
And thank you very much also for putting back into focus the IDPs and of course also highlighting the challenges that are posed by the current pandemic, also in your field. That will bring me to the two respondents. The first respondent will be Xavier de Victor from the World Bank. He works as an advisor manager on fragility, conflict, and violence. He has a history at the UNHCR as well, but that was a long time ago. He has already, since the 1990s, been with the World Bank as a country manager of different countries and program coordinator. And I think the World Bank is very well suited. It was already referred to be represented here, also because it works very closely together with, which was also mentioned already, the Prospect Partnerships. So I'd be very happy to hear your contribution. I do. Yes, there you are. You have the floor, Mr. de Victor.
Thank you so much, and thank you very, very much to the Ministry for this invitation, and also for just hosting the panel on or the event on such an important topic. Let me maybe start with a reflection. What we're talking about here is people. It's people living in distressful situations, and it's about finding the best ways to support them. I think it's very important as we proceed through our conversation that we make a genuine effort not to abstractize these issues too much, but remain very, very grounded in the reality of the people, including those who are on the picture in the poster behind my colleague and friend Jorrit Malik. I think so. Maybe a few points that I wanted to propose as a reflection to what Sajat was saying. First, to underline that indeed the World Bank has been engaged, increasingly engaged in forced displacement issues, and we've tried to do this in very close partnership with UNHCR to start with. Partnership very much rooted in the principles of the Global Compact on refugee. A partnership that's very much strategic, not transactional. It's not about channeling money. It's really about trying to learn from UNHCR and trying to align our respective instruments and our respective programs. And also trying to think some of these issues through together. Sajat was referring to the paper that we wrote. Actually, it was written with extensive support by UNHCR. And so this partnership is both at corporate level, but also in the field. And the idea is really for both of our organizations to work in synergy while focusing on what we economists would call our areas of comparative advantage. Now, I underline this partnership. Obviously, the bank is working in other partnerships, and let me mention also prospects and the role of the Dutch government in trying to build this very innovative partnership that includes UNHCR, UNICEF, ILO, and the two branches of the World Bank, IFC, and of the World Bank Group, IFC and the World Bank, to try and support programs towards economic inclusion and education. Now, if you allow me, I'd just like to take just a few very brief moments to think about what does it mean to bring a development approach to this issue? Because at the end of the day, it's not about more money. It's not about different sectors of engagement. It's sometimes not even about the timing of engagement, right? I think it's a long time ago, there was this notion there was first humanitarians and development at a middle ground where we needed to so-called handover. I think we passed this point. I think we now recognize that these are actually two, humanitarian and development, actually two instruments by the same international community. And that these two instruments have to be wielded in synergy throughout the crisis. So the development approach is not a substitute for humanitarian assistance. And let me say very, very explicitly that humanitarian actors still need financing, even if we are engaged, still need the same sort of amounts of financing as they used to have, even if we are engaged, because what we're doing is essentially complement what they're doing. And I think the difference in a way between the development and humanitarian instruments of the international community is about the way we work. We tend to focus very much on medium-term and socioeconomic issues. We tend also, because that's what we've learned, to think that real changes come when policies are improved, government policies are improved, and institutions are strengthened. And therefore, we tend to work primarily with government, to put government in the lead, as we say in our jargon, and to try to reinforce country systems, and also to use data and evidence to that effect. Now, none of this is incompatible with the humanitarian agenda, of course, but it is something that is, once again, complementary. And what I would like really to emphasize for this conversation is really this notion of one international community, different instrument. And the question is, how do you use your hammer and your screwdriver in different yet complementary way throughout the crisis. So we have indeed developed financial instruments to engage. I think this has been the major shift for us. We currently have projects in 18 countries, I think 63 projects for a total of about $3 billion. So that's quite a lot of work. Once again, very, very much in partnership and in synergy with UNHCR. But I also wanted to maybe flag 2 points that Sajjad has mentioned. One is the importance of aligning our policy dialogue. I was really emphasizing the point about the importance of policies in refugee hosting countries. What we call policy dialogue, some of our colleagues call it advocacy dialogue or advocacy effort. Regardless of the vocabulary we use, I think what's really important is that when we engage with the refugee hosting countries, we do so in a manner that is as consistent as possible, and of course, as supportive as possible. And this is why this refugee policy review framework, which goes by an unpronounceable acronym RPRF, is becoming extremely useful by essentially benefiting from UNHCR's insights on the relative strengths and weaknesses of government policies in each of 20 areas, government refugee policies in each of 20 areas. That allows us to, number one, structure and focus choose the areas of focus for our policy dialogue in a kind of systematic manner. And number two, to do this in a coherent way across organizations. So we're very, very grateful to UNHCR for all their engagement on this RPIF, because we do believe that this is an instrument we need to better align our policy dialogues on the ground. And then the last point I wanted maybe to emphasize the point that Sajjad made. Many of us, I guess, around the table are parents. And which of us would be satisfied with our kids having a 68% chance to go to primary school? I mean, what do they know by the time they reach 5th grade, right? And only 34% going to secondary school, right? And so I feel that in a context where about half of refugees are actually children, it is our common interest for both humanitarian and geopolitical reasons to really strengthen our response in this area. And maybe I should stop here.
Thank you very much. I think we're perfectly on time. I will, without much further ado, then continue to our third speaker, to the second respondent, and that is Kelsey Norman, who is a fellow for the Middle East and director of the Women's Rights, Human Rights and Refugees Program. I'm having a note here at the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University. And one of the reasons, of course, that she is speaking today is because of her recent book on reluctant reception, refugees, migration and governance in the Middle East and North Africa. And I'm sure that you will share some very interesting insights from that book with us here. The floor is yours, and welcome to The Hague.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I actually have a PowerPoint. I don't know if it's possible to...
It is possible, however, there you will need to say next slide, and then the control room will help you, will put the next slide. Am I correct?
Okay.
Yes.
That's correct. Okay, perfect. I can't see it though, so I don't know which slide we're on, but...
You're on the first slide that says presentation.
Wonderful, thank you. So yes, thank you for giving me the honor of presenting here today. I apologize, I can see it now, wonderful. I wasn't able to attend many of the panels earlier, just given the time difference, so I'm so sorry to have missed out on those interesting conversations, and apologies for anything that's sort of repeated by me today. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the question that I primarily address in this book is, how do global South countries respond to migrant and refugee populations? And this is a broad question. Of course, we're talking about many different countries and many different regions. And I specifically focus on the Middle East, North Africa region. If you could go to the next slide. Thank you. So specifically, I look at 3 countries, Morocco, Egypt, and Turkey. And you can see from this infographic that they're seen as sort of transit countries for both refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants hoping to head up towards Europe. But this infographic is a bit of a misrepresentation that, of course, it's actually not easy to complete those migratory journeys. So many individuals end up staying in countries like Morocco, Egypt, and Turkey for long periods of time and sort of sometimes protracted situations. And, you know, I am using the terms migrants and refugees here. I did speak with both refugees and asylum seekers, but also migrants who are more or less in refugee-like situations. So I'm happy to talk more about those terms in the Q&A. But part of the reason that that these countries are being more or less transformed into host countries has to do with some of the EU's changing border policies over the last several decades, making those migratory journeys much harder to complete, and thus necessitating the question of, well, how do countries in this region, but also in the global south more broadly, respond to migrants or refugees? What kind of policy options do they have? Next slide, please. So part of the impetus for today's conference is, of course, the anniversary of the 1951 Convention. And interestingly, all three of these countries that I'm examining are signatories to the 51 Convention and the 67 Protocol. Turkey, of course, with geographical limitations, as I suspect has already been discussed here today. So these are just some of the agreements that these three countries have in place with the EU, but in terms of a bilateral sense, but that of course doesn't preclude other important agreements that are important when we think about how these countries conceive of the presence of migrants and refugees. Next slide, please. So what I'm proposing in this book, and this is where we get a little more abstract, but I'm happy to talk more about it in the Q&A, is that sometimes we don't think about the ways that states respond to migrants and refugees as being actual responses when there aren't strong policies or laws in place domestically. So we tend to think about engagement in terms of a response that a state has to migrants and refugees as being either liberal or repressive. So by liberal, we mean a state that's actively working to bring migrants and refugees into a national system by providing social services, by offering education within national schools, offering access to public health or hospitals, things like this. And I think generally speaking, this is what international organizations and countries in the global north would like to see from countries of the global south, right? But that's not always the kind of policy that's in place, and generally not often the policy that's in place. We also can conceive of a more repressive response that actually aims to, round up migrants or refugees or asylum seekers, to detain them, to actually, in some cases, even deport them from a host state. But I think what we more often see, and what I'm arguing in this book, is this, what I call strategic indifference. So this is the idea that states aren't going to take a very hands-on, proactive approach to migrants and refugees. Rather, they're going to sort of proclaim indifference to the issue. And what this means is that it invites international organizations like the UNHCR, like IOM, as well as local domestic civil society organizations to step in and provide all those services for the state, or sort of on the state's behalf to migrants and refugees. And this is, it works out pretty well for a lot of states for periods of time, until maybe something like an issue of migrants and refugees becomes politicized or securitized, and then maybe a state will act differently. But strategic indifference, I argue, basically offers more or less development funding for the state in terms of international organizations providing funding that not only benefits refugees, but often also benefits host country nationals. And it works in states where refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants can more or less de facto integrate into host state systems. And this works in urban contexts, which, as we know, most refugees in the world do live in urban environments, and certainly all migrants do in the global south. So if you can go to the next slide then. Actually, in the interest of time, I'll kind of skip over this, basically just talking about some of the evidence that I bring to bear on this question, involving a lot of interviews in the three countries that I look at over a period of time, and speaking both with government officials, UN actors, NGOs, and individual migrants and refugees of a variety of nationalities. Okay, if we could go to the next slide then. So what I talk about at great length in this book is the ways in which this policy of strategic indifference structures the lives of migrants and refugees who end up living under these types of policies. And what I argue is that, again, this works in urban environments where migrants and refugees can more or less live amongst host country nationals. These are just some snapshots from certain neighborhoods that are basically known as refugee, asylum seeker, and migrant sort of neighborhoods in different cities in the countries that I was looking at. So they're living amongst host country nationals. They're also often finding access to informal employment, generally not formal employment, as I'm sure has been discussed today. Most countries, or at least certainly the three countries that I've looked at, even if in some cases certain nationals were eligible to find employment in the formal economy, most were not able to. Practically speaking, it's quite difficult for a number of reasons. And then the next slide, please. So what I want to demonstrate in this book is that even though from a legal and sort of policy perspective, refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants have difficulty participating in formal ways, they're participating to a great extent informally, whether that's economically, socially, or even politically in some cases. So they're finding jobs, as I said, in the informal economy. The picture on the left is two individuals working at a restaurant in Gaziantep, for example, two individuals from Syria. They're finding co-nationals or sometimes individuals from other nationalities whom they can find housing with, as in the picture from Rabat in the middle. And they're also learning about the informal norms that are really important in their host states. For example, in the picture on the left, finding out which police officers are friendly and which other types of security officers that they need to avoid. So even when the formal participation, whether economically, socially, politically, is not necessarily possible, they're still able to participate informally to a great extent. Sorry, I guess I'm seeing that I have very little time left. I just wanted to go on to the next slide. Oh, sorry, someone messaged me saying 1 minute. Okay, good. I'll continue on for just another few minutes then, if that's okay. So I want to jump forward in a slightly different direction now and talk about a new project that I'm working on, because I think it brings to bear on the question of, well, how can we incentivize maybe more formal participation, or how can we ensure that individuals have access to rights in countries that we're calling countries of transit, but that are also host states in their own right. And so I think this question changed a little bit after the 2015, quote unquote, crisis of asylum seekers arriving in Europe and Europe's subsequent various responses, including the European Trust Fund for Africa, which I caught a little bit of the previous session, and I know that was being discussed. So if we recall, the EUTF was sort of a big pot of money that was put together by Europe after in November 2015, sort of shortly after the Paris attacks and the rhetoric around refugees and Europe's willingness to receive asylum seekers and allow them to stay began to change. So this money was put together. Various countries across North and Sub-Saharan Africa have had access to it. And basically a colleague and I, Nick Masinski of the University of Maine, are looking at how has this money actually been used on the ground, and how is it changing the situation for refugees and asylum seekers, but also for host country nationals and citizens and governance, broadly speaking, in the countries that are receiving it. So specifically, we're looking at Egypt, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Kenya. If I could go to the next slide, please. So when we look at those 4 countries, which altogether there were 169 projects that were across those 4 different countries funded by the EUTF between 2015 and 2020, and we look at the way that Europe has allocated this money in the sort of categories to which it allocates those funds, it's a little bit unclear how that money is being spent. So for example, the largest category is improved migration management, but one could argue that all of this money is being used towards migration management effectively. So it's not clear what that means exactly, and it doesn't give us a lot of insight into how that money is being spent domestically. So what we've gone through is we've taken these 169 projects along with the more than 1,000 documents that are that pertain to them, and recoded them with a team of researchers here at Rice University. Next slide, please. And once we recode them according to our codebook, which we'll make available and we're happy to share, we can see, I think we get a better picture of how that money is actually being spent domestically. So for example, economic development is the largest category in terms of how funds are being allocated, which is in line with what the EUTF proclaims to want to do, right? It wants to improve economic development and allegedly democratic governance in countries of origin and transit, with the ultimate aim of preventing onward migration towards Europe. But we can see, for example, the second most prominent category, oops, if you could just go back, yeah, thank you, is state capacity. And that's where we're wondering if there's the possibility for sort of unintended side effects, perhaps, if a lot of that funding is going towards institutions in a recipient country, for example, ministries of the interior or security forces, with the goal of securing borders, but what are the spillover effects of that type of funding and support for states? And that's part of what we're hoping to investigate with this project, as well as you can see a number of other categories that are being funded through this pot of money. Next category. And I think, sorry, next slide I meant. So I think that this is particularly important given some of the rhetoric around the EUTF and how exactly that funding is being spent domestically. For example, the director of the German Development Agency here says, one thing is clear, human rights come first. We do not strengthen autocratic structures. No money goes to the governments of the countries we work in. But if you can see from the next slide, we know at least from these 4 countries that we're looking at that that's not true. So about 20% of funding is going directly to governments, and we're looking at which ministries or actors within a state are receiving that funding, but that there's also just a number of different funding structures that are in place with the EUTF, whether it's NGOs are being funded directly or if an EU delegation is being funded. So what we're doing with this project, and we're still in the midst of it all, is trying to understand how that money is being spent domestically. Last slide. So to just sort of tie this all together, I've argued in this book that I recently published this year that global South states often are going to turn to this strategic indifference, what I'm calling strategic indifference, to manage refugee and migrant populations. And certainly, I think global North states, as well as international organizations and some domestic actors too, civil rights groups, maybe refugees themselves, would like to see states implement a more liberal policy, right, and take on more responsibility for refugee, asylum seeker, and maybe even migrant populations. We have seen states, for example, in my study, Turkey and Morocco, that do turn towards more liberal policies. But the problem is that because of the incentives that led them to do so, sometimes these policies are mostly for show, and they're not so much about ensuring actual rights for refugees on the ground. So I'm a little bit weary of just offering sort of more financial incentives or even diplomatic incentives to global South countries in turn for implementing a more liberal policy, because it doesn't always mean that they're going to follow through on implementation on the ground. But nonetheless, I think a major takeaway from my book is that it's really critical to understand the incentives of various global South states. I mean, states generally speaking, but particularly I'm looking at global South states here, to understand what are their incentives regarding refugee and migration policies, because I think there's a lot of assumptions about how they'll act, and some of those don't always pan out. And then lastly, last sentence, I promise. So lastly, in terms of my new project, and I think this ties in, if we're going to offer aid, if the global North or international organizations are going to offer aid towards supporting refugees in the global South, we have to make sure it's non-fungible, it can't be utilized for other purposes or reallocated, that it's rights-oriented and not just security-oriented, and that there should be an emphasis on transparency and accountability, which really are lessons from sort of the broader understanding of how foreign aid needs to operate. So thank you for that. I appreciate the opportunity to present today.
Thank you very much. And also thank you very much for providing some much needed transparency. I'm sure that there's someone from the European Parliament who would be very interested in learning more about your research. The Court of Auditors has also referred to the Trust Fund and its intransparency. I'd be very interested now in hearing perhaps Mr. Malik, if you would like to respond to anything of the two that the two discussants have said, maybe also reply to the strategic indifference if you or Mr. De Victor would like to come in on that. So Mr. Malik, you would have the floor if you wish. I think you're still muted.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, all right. Now, thank you very much for both. I think it's important to recognize that the engagement with governments on policy reforms, yes, investments are going in these countries, but the policy trade-off discussion is important to have. It is in some countries, and we've seen through some of the investments that are going in, if we have, carefully track where the changes are coming in. Sometimes the changes are slow to come for various reasons, and we know they've been hosting refugees. I can remember Afghan refugees crossing the border, and I come from very close to the Afghan border in Pakistan when I was in high school. they're still in Pakistan for the last 40 years. And in millions in that. And I was in Kenya receiving Somali refugees when the Dadaab refugee camps were being opened. And we were told to establish the camp for three years. It's now 33 years that those camps are on the ground. So I think we need to keep that in mind, that this burden that has been on these host countries for protracted period and left for decades on humanitarian assistance only. What is called care and maintenance, very basic education, very basic assistance. Generations have gone through those camps, blocked their potential, no education, no livelihoods, no jobs, no interactions. And we have seen that in the same countries, if there's some incentives that are provided and there's support that goes into that country, and there's careful management of debate and discussion with the policy reform, changes do come in. Kilobiai, Kenya is one example. It's still not there where we want it to be, but at least change is coming in. Rwanda, on the other hand, had relatively liberal policies in the region, and their support that went in, even if they had liberal policies, if the support was not there, they would not have been able to manage the work that they have done. I think that encouragement needs to go in these countries where the incentives are. Lebanon, it's in a very difficult state right now because of its own situation. But Lebanon, when Syrian refugees cross the border, they open up their schools, double shifts, making sure that children can go to school. Syrians hold education very dear to them. And when they crossed the border and could not find education, it was really a big blow to the parents, to population in general, parents in particular, that they come from a country where education levels are very high, 96% primary education, and all of a sudden they become refugees and no support there. The World Bank, GCFF financing and others had helped their creating that capacity. Similarly in Jordan, in Venezuela situation, Colombia, you see many examples where there are policies of that they could be provided and supported with that. Then the right to education, you can see a little bit more in practice. You can see public health support is being provided. What we want to see is more of those practices and not parallel services created for decades. Because then in those parallel services now, we also need to keep in mind what's happening around the globe. We keep on asking refugee hosting countries to be more liberal, open, inclusive, and all the rest, but we also see borders being closed elsewhere. We're also seeing refoulement, pushback, externalization, all these things. So debate is becoming extremely difficult, and it's not necessarily tied to always to resources, but resources are needed. There's hardly enough for the development of their own population. And that also in periphery area, not in the capitals, not in the centers. These are always remote areas where refugees are being hosted, and their assistance is absolutely required in that. So I think it's the support that we see, that when we say World Bank has been a game changer, it's a fact that's been, they brought a new dimension to this whole debate. And in reality, in practice, it's not just a debate around that. And I think others are beginning to see that this debate has to happen. So let me just add one more perspective here, which is important. So in a refugee hosting countries, government, receives support from many partners. World Bank talks to the same government. Other bilateral development partners talk to the same government, and then government has perspectives from various partners, not necessarily always aligned. And that also creates a lot of difficulties for government to harmonize this debate that is happening around those areas. I think upstream, there's also more discussion needs to happen. This debate is good to have, to understand the perspectives around, from practitioners, from researchers, from donor governments, from ministries, foreign affairs. All these are important discussions to have. Rights focus on that, but also in true spirits of burden and responsibility sharing is absolutely essential to go with it. Otherwise, we cannot keep on telling them to do certain things, refugee hosting countries, but not match with what we are doing in our own backyard, but also how the support gets to them. It's all important in that sense.
Thank you very much. Before I open up the floor to questions, possibly from the chat, but also from here, I was wondering, Mr. De Victor, would you perhaps still like to come in on this? I was very much triggered by the complementarity on the humanitarian and development dimension. Maybe you could elaborate on that a bit in the light of what Kelsey has just been telling us. If you're still with us. No? Sorry, he's gone? He's gone, okay. Well, then, so far so good. I see no, I see no questions. That's the challenges of hybrid. There he is, yes. Mr. De Victor, you're back. You are still muted, I'm afraid. You're still muted? Yes. Let's see. I think you can unmute yourself.
Maybe try it without the headphones. I think it's not saying he's muted, actually.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, exactly. No, you are not muted. Oh, we were doing so well. No, now I don't see anyone. I'm just going to. Are there any questions from the floor, and then we can throw these in and see who of our three speakers is willing. I see Tineke already. Tineke Strik. Willem, if you could be so kind to give her the floor, and then I hope, and I hope the control room will have everyone lined up. I see another question there.
Yeah. So you houdt hem vast, hè? Yeah, to Mr. Malik, I concur very much with you, the importance of access to education. And I wonder, because in many refugee hosting countries, the education system is also limited for own inhabitants. Are there concrete projects already within that other, more wealthy states also support educational systems through their own universities or education systems? I can imagine we learned a lot from COVID-19, how much you can do with remote support in that sense. And to Mrs. Norman, if I may, I find it very interesting, your scenario of strategic indifference, and also showing that there's a kind of show to comply with the conditions. I wonder, shouldn't that may have to do also with knowing that what the priority of the EU is, namely the objective of combating irregular migration instead of improving the situation of refugees? And could a change be made? Like, I really think EU member states think we can only use our leverage once. And the most important thing for us is border closed and readmission. But suppose if we turn it around, if we prioritize the condition of having good circumstances and perspectives for refugees in hosting countries, without having this additional condition of border controls. And what do you think what would happen? Would that indeed lead to people building up their futures over there? Or would there still be a ground for fear from states that people will still stay on the move towards the West?
Before you answer, I see there's one or two more questions from the side of Foreign Affairs. Yes, please. And then, Mr. De Victor, I will come back to you to see if we manage to hear you here now. But first, the gentleman from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah, good afternoon. Interesting presentations. And also the reaction of Tineke Strik is relevant here. I think we're talking about two different things. One is the development approaches to displacement in the regions of origin. And the other one is plain migration management. I wouldn't go as far as Madame Strik to say that the interest of the EU is just to curb irregular migration. That's part of the interest, indeed. We're a bit schizophrenic in that respect. I think also another part of the EU is sincerely trying to help improve lives of refugees. But I see the same in the presentation of Madame Norman, because you're saying like the support should really go to right-based, right-based interventions and so on. As if you're hinting at sort of the cooperation with dodgy governments in terms of curbing irregular migration. While at the same time, I think an important takeaway from this forum should be that unless we take other countries' governments that are receiving refugees seriously in equal partnerships, we're not going to resolve this problem.
Thank you very much. 3 very clear questions. Can I ask you to answer them perhaps briefly? And I will start with Kelsey Norman and then go down the line. So you have the floor first.
Yeah, thank you to both questions. I see sort of a similarity, so I'll try to just answer them together. I think both of you have sort of hit the nail on the head in terms of part of, I think my argument is exactly as the last commenter said, to take countries in the global south more seriously as equal partners. And yet, of course, some of these partners do have questionable human rights records, treatment towards their own citizens. So how can we do both, right? How can we take them seriously, but also ensure that that money that's being offered or that support that's being offered is actually benefiting those whom it would hope to benefit. And I think there's one is, as I said at the end of my presentation, ensuring that aid is fungible and non-fungible, in terms of it being spent on exactly what it needs to be spent on and not being allocated for potentially other purposes, potentially repressive purposes. But also I think there's a hypocrisy element to it, right? And I think this was alluded to in the very end of the last presentation, which I was able to catch, in terms of, if the underlying goal of the EUTF is to prevent onward migration towards Europe, I think other countries are not, they're going to see that. They understand that, and they understand how that can be potentially manipulated or utilized to benefit their own governments. And so I think that that countries in Europe, as well as my own country, the United States, and other countries of the global north, have to step up in terms of not just offering money, which has become the name of the game in terms of this alleged burden sharing that was discussed in the previous panel. I think that countries of the global north have to take on actual responsibility for refugees and asylum seekers in terms of resettlement, in terms of alternative pathways to physically getting people from countries in the global south. And I don't think that just offering aid is a substitute for actually participating in the global refugee system. So I think that that's sort of the dual-pronged answer to how to better engage with global refugee burden sharing, but also how to engage with countries of the global south, even those who maybe have questionable human rights records.
Thank you very much. Then I'll go on to Sajjad Malik. Would you perhaps answer to some of the questions or part of the questions?
Yeah, thanks. And I think let me just on the education, the question which was quite important for us to look at. Yes, we are working on it. It's very important aspect of when you're looking at the potential that refugees have displaced, and including IDPs. It's the same problem with any forced displacement, that if they remain in a situation in limbo for a protracted period of time and there's no education, obviously you'll have to do things about it. Now, during COVID time, we did come around lockdowns, universities and schools getting shut down. Then connectivity became a major problem in refugee hosting countries. We did not have, like most of the countries in middle income countries where there is connectivity, there are tools available. Most of refugee camps do not have electricity, did not have connectivity, let alone the tools that are required for such education to be brought. So different means were applied there just to continue bringing education to these people. So yes, we have learned from COVID, but the challenges were also exposed that if we do not have these basics that are taken for granted in our part of the world, is not there for refugees, then of course there's something that needs to be done. So we're working on that. For secondary, there's a challenge that we need to make sure, working with governments, but we need support. It's not us needing support, it's those refugees and forcibly displaced that need support to be included in the national education system. Cannot create parallel structures for secondary and primary and tertiary, so need to be included in that. On the tertiary side, as I mentioned, Germany has been supporting on tertiary scholarship for the last 30 years, the DAFI program. We're looking for other donors, universities to come in and join us on that. We're going for a campaign which is now called 15 by 30, which means we want to increase the secondary education level from 5% currently to 15% by 2030. Still far below international standards, but we are saying, let's bring a few more to universities. And we saw the value of it during COVID. Refugees, DAFI scholarship students who have gone to universities, public health, nurses, doctors, contributed to the societies in many countries. They've been in the forefront in fighting COVID, and they've shown to these countries how important it is that if you have educated refugees living amongst you, they can contribute to that. So I think that one focus will remain quite a lot. The other thing I would like to highlight is it's not replacing humanitarian assistance with development. That's not the question. We'll still need humanitarian support, but it's cannot stop at just the life-saving humanitarian activities. You need to invest in activities such as education, public health, social protection, livelihoods, all these which we have discussed in the previous panels. These investments are required and for extended period around that. One last example, Afghanistan, we're discussing quite extensively now. The debate there is quite political. There's life-saving work that needs to be done and is going on, but that's not enough. We can bring life-saving assistance, but we also need to bring assistance for them to live. We are having a debate right now in Afghanistan, humanitarian plus or development minus. While the needs in that country, for the people of Afghanistan, that's something that is a big debate that's happening right now. If that doesn't happen, of course it will implode. Of course, there's no other alternative but people for them to move. Then the borders are closed and you move, and then you can look at the whole equation around that. So it's the root causes that need to be addressed as well, that it's not just looking at the displacement, but also looking at some of these areas from where displacement is happening. And there, Afghanistan is a very clear example right now that is being looked at. And lastly, on
Mr. I'm going to have to ask you to maybe one final conclusion.
One final conclusion is that, look, this for the livelihoods, it had devastating impact on populations when they were informal economy, in jobs that they were earning that was totally an informal sector, not really recognized on that. When lockdowns happened, they were the first ones to be impacted. And then the downward spiral has given them the legal vulnerability is absolutely critical that we need to look into as we go along into some of these programs. I stop here, otherwise the risk is that I continue moving on these issues. So I pass it back to you.
Thank you very much. I'm getting messages from all sides that I have to wrap up, but I do want to give the possibility for one last final comment from Mr. De Victor, because so sadly you were muted either on our side or on your side. I don't know, but maybe we can see if you still can give us one or two words to wave us off with. No, I'm afraid you're still muted. I'm very sorry. This is unfortunately. I do want to thank you. We're very happy that at least your first comment was clear to all. I would like to thank all three speakers and conclude this panel. A round of applause.